Okay, so we're going to start by talking today about foundations of American democracy. And we begin by talking about how colonists, when they arrived here in the New World, they already had ideas of what government should be set up like. A lot of those ideas came from England. Some of those ideas came through how they set up their colonies, law and order, things of that nature. Up until 1776, what event happened in 1776? What happened, Hunter? You say it again?
Boston Massacre.
Boston Massacre did happen, but something even bigger than that happened. Something was written. Nope, not yet.
The Constitution.
Not yet.
Declaration.
Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. This important declaration said that we're not going to follow English law anymore. Say it again. Traditions. So these traditions came from, like I said, they came from the homeland in England, but they also came from colonies. Things like people's voice in government should matter. But we'll talk about this a little bit more, that everyone didn't have the right to vote within these laws, how it was set up. It was only the wealthy and the educated people. They did have a lot of protections. They did have some rights, but as we see, leading up to the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, those rights were slowly taken away by the homeland and by England. All right, so we've got some important sources of democracy and where democracy comes from. One of the most important sources is something called the Code of Hammurabi. You'll learn a lot about that next year in 8th grade world history, who Hammurabi was. But Hammurabi wrote a code of laws way back, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And these laws were established to help govern the people and help them govern themselves. You also had someone named Justin that wrote the Justinian Code. Our founding fathers took these codes to help develop our legal system. We followed after places like ancient Greece and Rome. We followed after important documents like the Magna Carta that limited the power that the king had in England in the 1200s. All of these things help come together to help us understand what a constitution should really look like.
Okay, so that means they tried to come up with the law in 1776 and it was passed in 1781.
That's right. So the Articles of Confederation weren't passed until 1781 because of the lack of cooperation. And it all stemmed from those questions. How are we going to prevent the unfair treatment that was received by the British prior to, for well over 100 years, and especially during King George III's reign, they received a lot of unfair treatment. They were unfairly taxed. We talked about those things, remember? The things like the Stamp Act. Remember the tea taxes. All those things led to the Revolutionary War. Yes, Carson? 1781. So they had to make that decision. How are we going to make laws? Are the states going to be represented by the population, or is everybody going to get the same amount of votes? So there had to be a compromise made. And we'll see what that compromise was here in just a second. All right, so the Articles of Confederation had some provisions in it. These are important. The Articles created a loose union, which meant that the states had just about all of the rights. Is that a problem?
Yes.
That becomes a problem later, doesn't it? But initially, you have to remember that the colonists were so fed up with government control. They were so fed up with England, how England controlled everything that they did. They were scared to death to allow the national government to have any control at all. So they create a unicameral legislature. Now today we have a bicameral legislature, which means that we have a House on one side and a Senate on the other. So we have two houses. So any law that's passed has to go through two houses today. But then it only had to go through one. And each state received one vote. You can see where that would be a problem also. Big states have the same amount of votes as a small state like Rhode Island. And Rhode Island's a tiny little speck on the map compared to a place like New York. But that's how it was set up. So we mentioned some of the weaknesses, but the main weaknesses are you have too much emphasis on state rights, limited power to tax and raise an army, which, presents a tremendous problem if you get attacked by another country, right? We have to remember that we had already been through it twice with the French, then with the British. So you never knew when it would happen again. The national government didn't have money to even they couldn't raise enough money to even have any soldiers. You had to rely on those state militias. And you didn't have a president or a court system to settle disputes between states. And you were starting to have some of those. So this is causing big problems. So in 1787, we see the Second Constitutional Congress. This met in Philadelphia. All the states were represented except for who? Rhode Island. The plan was to revise the Articles, but that was impossible. They realized when they started looking at the problems that the Articles presented that it was just going to be necessary to start over. So the delegates requested that each state write a new constitution. They wanted every state to write its own constitution. As we know, as you've already found out, there were several plans that did come back. We'll talk about those a little more later. Okay, so in drafting the Constitution, the purpose was to try to revise the Articles, but they just decided to start over. Now, all this was done in secret initially. They had some debates. They debated over whether the small groups would become more dominant in government, which meant that small groups of people would always get their way. So they were concerned, should we give more power to the states or to the central government? Well, they already knew that the states having the power just would not work. So they all agreed on this. This is important for you to know, okay? They all agreed on the premise of representative government. You have to remember that representative government is essentially what makes the United States different in all of the world. There are a lot of democracies in the world, but there are very few representative democracies. So that's what sets us apart. The forefathers were mostly concerned with popular sovereignty, religious toleration, and separation of powers. All of these things become very important in the writing of the Constitution. So in drafting the Constitution, you have to have compromise. Initially, you have a couple of plans that come back. The Virginia plan was drafted by James Madison. He's considered to be the father of the Constitution, and that's kind of important for you to know. It was a bicameral legislature, which meant it had a House and a Senate, but it was based solely on population. This presents a problem because the smaller states didn't feel like they had equal representation. It also had a system of checks and balances between three branches of government so that no one part became too powerful. So we have that today in an executive, judicial, and legislative branch. The New Jersey plan was drafted by William Patterson, and it called for equal representation all the way across the board. So no matter what size state you were, they felt like you should have equal representation. Now, it's very interesting to know where these people came from. Virginia happened to be one of the biggest states at the time per population, and New Jersey happened to be one of the smallest. So they wrote it to try to benefit them. And remember, I said we had to get a compromise. So the Great Compromise is drafted by Roger Sherman. This was big states versus small states. So you have a House of Representatives that is based on population. So in Alabama, we have 9 representatives. We have 9 electoral votes total. Okay? 7 of those come from the House. 2 of those come from the Senate. So it doesn't matter how small or how big your state is, you have 2 senators in your state. But the House of Representatives is based on population. So these were things that in the initial Constitution that had to be decided. This helps everybody's vote to count. Okay? You also had some things like the 3/5 compromise dealing with slave trade. Not that important that you get it down, but we will talk a little bit more about that in the future. All right, so the Constitution divides the power, divides it up, and remember what I said, you've got judicial, legislative, and executive branch, all of those powers. Anytime you have three branches, can you have a tie with three? No, you can't. So you never have to worry about having a tie. They all hold each other accountable, and through those checks and balances, they make sure that everybody is doing their job. Okay. So in July 1788, 11 of 13 states had ratified the Constitution. By this point, they had reconvened and voted 194 to 77 in favor of the Constitution. So you had some changes. Things like the Bill of Rights came along by this time. George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. So this is in 1788.